gameranx proudly presents a history of the Need for Speed series. EA's Need for Speed racing series has been around since longer than some gamers have been born, and there are a ton of games to talk about, so let's get started. The original Need for Speed released in 1994 for the 3DO. It came out a year later for PlayStation, PC, and Sega Saturn. This first Need for Speed was sponsored and made in collaboration with the magazine Road and Track. Oddly enough, the early Need for Speed games, including this one, strive to have realistic racing physics and make it a complete realistic racing sim. And although this was the first Need for Speed game, it did feature tracks that had you chased by police cars. This is something that we'll see a lot in this franchise years to come. Need for Speed 2 was released in 1997. It raised the bar and upped the excitement factor with better graphics and more exotic and weird concept cars. And a little fun fact, the PlayStation version of this was the first PlayStation game to actually take advantage of the DualShock and dual analog controllers. The Need for Speed series then spun off a bit with V-Rally, a Need for Speed rally-style racing game released in 1997. This game for the time was praised for its realistic rally racing physics. There was a bunch of locations and a beloved two-player split-screen mode. V-Rally was a big hit and was spread across multiple platforms, starting on PlayStation, but was later ported to PC, Game Boy, Nintendo 64, and Game Boy Color in the span of the next 2 years. It's funny too, it was praised for its graphics, but really, looking back, every car looks the same. Then in 1998, Need for Speed got its first absolute smash hit with Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit. Need for Speed 3 added the now famous Hot Pursuit mode, where the player got to either run from the cops or play as the cop and chase racers. Hot Pursuit was praised across the board by reviewers and loved by players. It's also when the series really started to find its footing. Instead of just competing with other realistic racing sims like Gran Turismo that it obviously couldn't beat, Need for Speed went the other route and catered to fans who liked action movies and car chases. In 1999, we got Need for Speed High Stakes. This time around, the Need for Speed game featured exotic and expensive sports cars across all different locations worldwide. This was also the first game to include vehicle damage. This game also had the most game modes yet, including pursuits, tournaments, and the special event mode. At this point in time, the Need for Speed games were top of their class in racing AI. By 1999, the annual releases started to churn out with V-Rally 2. V-Rally 2 is the sequel to the first Need for Speed rally racing game and featured multiple new game modes and different weather effects. There was also a track editor for players to mess around with, which was for the time pretty limited, but still really cool. The year 2000 saw a very unique game for the Need for Speed franchise with Porsche Unleashed. This Need for Speed game featured exclusive races only with Porsches. Players would pick a bunch of different Porsches throughout history and race around European tracks. You also got to play races and race through the decades of Porsche. And for a licensed product-style game, it was actually pretty cool, and featured a ton of extensive info about Porsches, which I know I will never own one. In 2002, we got Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. Hot Pursuit 2 was the smash hit beloved game that was actually the first Need for Speed game for the next generation of consoles, PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox. Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 was of course one of the best in the series and is historic. It had a bunch of different game modes, great split-screen multiplayer, and of course, Hot Pursuit mode was more intense than ever, with police cars being extremely aggressive and with racing players being faster than ever. Then in 2003, Need for Speed took its biggest turn in its series entries with Need for Speed Underground, my personal favorite. Need for Speed embraced that street culture style of racing and arcade-style gameplay. There was drag racing, drift competitions, and sprint races, and all of them were awesome. The coolest part was customizing your car to your heart's content, with everything down to the rims, tires, color trims, hoods, anything you wanted. Need for Speed Underground looked absolutely amazing graphically for its time, and it also paved the way for many features that we still have in Need for Speed games today. Then in 2004, we saw the sequel to Underground, Need for Speed Underground 2. Need for Speed Underground 2 embraced and really ramped up the story mode and an open-world driving environment. This time around, you could really customize the cosmetics of your vehicle and get more famous and on magazine covers. A new thing for the series, this time around, you could drive SUVs like Escalades and Lincoln Navigators. It was kinda stupid, but it was still awesome and added to an already huge style of game. In 2005, the PlayStation Portable saw its first Need for Speed game, Need for Speed Underground Rivals, which was actually a surprisingly decent version of the Need for Speed Underground games on console. There were lots of cars, the racing and sense of speed was pretty good, and it looked great for a handheld game. 2005 also saw the release of the multi-platform Need for Speed Most Wanted. This time around, EA wanted to elaborate on the free-roaming parts of Underground 2, but adding police chases from Hot Pursuit mode, and really embracing that team racing culture style from the Fast and Furious movies. This game focused on building up your racing skills and taking down rival gang racing members, and it was pretty fun. In 2005, PlayStation Portable also got its own version of Most Wanted called 510. 510 focused mostly on police chases and street racing. This one was all about different races and career mode, and didn't have an open world. Need for Speed Carbon was released in 2006, and it was the first Need for Speed game on PlayStation 3 and Wii. Need for Speed Carbon carries a story from Most Wanted. This time around, not only did you have to race rival street racing crews, but you had to build a crew of your own. All the street racing crew members had different skills that you had to use to your advantage. While there were police chases in the open world, they were definitely toned down this time around. We also got a handheld version of Need for Speed Carbon with Own the City for PSP, DS, and Game Boy Advance. While it was a very different game from the console versions graphically and control-wise, and there were no canyon races or drift events, it was the first Need for Speed handheld game to feature open-world police chases. The 11th official installment for Need for Speed was ProStreet, released in 2007. This was the first Need for Speed game since Underground to turn away from the street racing style of gameplay and focus completely on racing in high-end cars on closed tracks. That being said, this game featured a massive 46 different cars and a ton of customization. And despite it turning away from the street racing culture, it still featured street-style racing gameplay, including drag races and drift events, coupled with more classic circuit-style racing modes. It was the first game in the series for a while that critics and fans just weren't really into. In 2008, after the flop of ProStreet, EA decided to go back to its roots with Need for Speed Undercover. Need for Speed Undercover was decent and featured what everybody wanted: street racing, car customization, and police chases. And it also added a big fleshed out story mode with live action scenes. Ultimately, Need for Speed Undercover had mixed reactions from fans and reviewers once again, especially because at the times there were other games killing it like Midnight Club Los Angeles and Burnout Paradise. In 2009, EA tried its hand again at professional touring car racing simulator style game like ProStreet with Need for Speed Shift. Need for Speed Shift had more realistic racing physics and no bullshit. No story, just a massive career mode with a bunch of different racing styles. Shift featured 60 licensed cars, including BMWs and Audis, and it was pretty good. It controlled and played tight, the game modes were addicting, and it looked absolutely realistic and gorgeous for the time. With Shift, Need for Speed finally made a successful return to racing simulation over arcade racing, just like how it first started back in 1994. In 2009, Nintendo DS and Wii got its own little exclusive love with Need for Speed Nitro. Need for Speed Nitro was a casual and honestly pretty easy racing game, but it was decent. It had a bunch of different modes and featured fun, exciting, arcade-style races. You could also race in a bunch of different modes with 3 of your friends if they had Wii modes. In 2010, Need for Speed tried something different with Need for Speed World, a free-to-play, open-world MMO racing game that was available only on PC. Open-world racing game in the style of Most Wanted, Carbon, and Underground with a bunch of police chases, car tuning, and upgrading. We really couldn't find a way of nailing down exactly how many people played Need for Speed World, but its servers remained open for quite a long time, despite a lot of cheating and hacking. But unfortunately, Need for Speed World is finally shutting down its servers on July 14th, 2015. The Prodigal Son had returned. In 2010, we got a reboot of the Hot Pursuit series, and it was pretty much the best, a complete return to form with cops versus racers and racers versus cops. There were 60 different cars and a great free roam world that worked very well with the car chasing dynamic. This time around, players on both sides could upgrade their car with seemingly kind of weapons to help them out during car chases. Need for Speed Hot Pursuit was a hit and showed the world that everybody loved Need for Speed for car chases and awesome action. 2011 saw the return of Shift with Shift 2 Unleashed. Shift 2 was an absolutely massive realistic racing simulator with over 100 different vehicles. This was the first Need for Speed game that was a bit of a spin-off, as it was titled Shift 2 Unleashed with Need for Speed in tiny letters on the bottom. While it didn't bring anything quite new to the realistic racing sim genre, it just did it all damn well, and it was very good. 2011 also saw the release of Need for Speed The Run, focusing on the famous marathon run street race from San Francisco to New York across the United States. Need for Speed The Run had a big fleshed out story with quick time events, a main player character, and on-foot sections. The story was ultimately a little weird and awkward, but players ultimately enjoyed playing this one. Plus, there were a lot of real-world licensed vehicles and a bunch of different upgrades and tuning. So what's better than that? 2012 also saw the reboot of the Need for Speed Most Wanted franchise, this time around being developed by the awesome Criterion Games. Released for all the major consoles as well as mobile devices, Most Wanted was great, and featured fun open-world racing that felt like a good mix between Hot Pursuit and Burnout. It was a fun game to play and had a great balance between realistic racing sim and arcade racer. There was also this really cool mode called Easy Drive, which allowed players to actually drive their car around easy and modify performance on the fly. 2013 saw Need for Speed Rivals, the first Need for Speed game to make it to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Rivals had a good mix between the modern versions of Most Wanted and Hot Pursuit, as the players got to play as either a racer or a police car. Players were able to upgrade their cars with EMPs and other ways of stopping racers in their tracks, and it was a lot of fun. It was a little glitchy, but it looked gorgeous, played well, had a great soundtrack, and a great first outing for arcade racing fans with next-gen consoles. Branching over to mobile, 2015 saw Need for Speed No Limits for iOS and Android. This is the Need for Speed franchise's first game that was made just for mobile devices. And it wasn't just a ported or rehashed version of a console game. It has a bunch of crappy free-to-play elements in it, but ultimately it's just a fun little pick-up-and-play racing game. And at the time of this video, the next Need for Speed game is up and coming and as of yet to be released. Titled simply Need for Speed, this upcoming 2015 title seems to be a complete reboot of the Need for Speed franchise. This is going to be the 21st release in the Need for Speed series, and we really hope it's awesome. And it looks to feature a little bit of the spirit from Need for Speed Underground, featuring a bunch of awesome arcade racing, drifting, rainy streets, and a ton of car customization. We're really hoping it's awesome, and we can't wait to find out in fall 2015. So guys, that was the exhaustive history of the Need for Speed series. We threw a ton of games and a ton of information at you, so we want to know in the comments what your favorite Need for Speed game is. Now think carefully, there's a lot of them. And if you did have a good time and learned a thing or two about the series, give us a like because it really helps us out. And subscribing is even better because we do videos like this, we do giveaways, and a bunch of other fun stuff. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.